Hi, folks. Mr. McGlashan here, coming at you from coronavirus lockdown on the first day of spring. I hope everyone is healthy and well. This will be the first of a three-part series on the causes of the Great Depression, which, wow, could not be more relevant to where we're at right now. I mean, you go to the front page of the New York Times, and you see economic toll rising. Congress races on $1 trillion relief plan. What if they had thrown $1 trillion at the Great Depression in 1929? It would have been different, but that was not what we did. It's not how we responded. So part of the story is, of course, what the government didn't do right back in 1929, causing the Great Depression to be so terrible. So, folks, get your notes out. This is Notes 27, Politics of Boom and Bust, or Boom and Bust, Politics of Economics in the 1920s. This is going to be a substantive lesson for sure, so get your notes ready. At the end of this, of course, you are going to be doing a DBQ on what caused the Great Depression. And there's a lot of economics in this, a lot of politics, so strap in and get ready. So, folks, yes, when we talk about the Great Depression, we, of course, are talking about this unbelievable crash in the stock market, which is what started the whole thing. So this is growth in stocks during the 1920s. This is about 1921 right here. And this is the Dow Jones Industrial Average is what we're looking at. It's a measure of overall stock values. It's the largest 30 companies in America. You see this 1929, Black Tuesday is one of these drops in there, and it just keeps dropping till about 1932. So between 1929 and 32, the stock market in the United States lost about 89% of its value. So we are not there yet. Our market is lost about a quarter in the last month. Crazy times, people, but let's get going. So when we look at overall GDP of our economy, you can see that this crash right here is, of course, the Great Depression. But notice how big it is relative to the size of the economy. So what this graph is showing is the overall size of the United States economy per person, per capita. And you see that in the Great Depression, the entire economy lost about a third of its overall value. This one in 2009 was as big a drop, but what percent of the overall economy was lost? Much, much, much smaller. So you see, that's what's so devastating about the Great Depression. All right, so let's move on here. Where am I going to put myself? All right, ladies and gentlemen, our story starts in the early 1920s with some presidential elections. So let's touch base with Harding. So in 1920, we had an election. Keep in mind that in 1919, 1920 were extremely tumultuous times in the United States. The come down from World War I was very difficult economically. And as you all know from your 1919 stories, we had lots of strikes and lots of protesting and lots of unemployment. It was a whiplash time, 1919. But remarkably, the economy kind of turned around pretty quickly thereafter. So most of the real terrible economic indicators of 1919 were gone by 1922. Warren Harding ran on a platform of return to normalcy here. And so that was a big part of what was going on. Is starting the 1920s, everyone wanted to get past World War I, past all the difficult dramas of the late 19 teens. So Warren Harding, not one of our more impressive presidents. He was a nice guy. I say affable. He was a womanizer for sure. Notably, he was a compromise candidate. The party, the Republican Party, tried dozens of votes to pick somebody until they just could not find a majority at their convention for anyone. And so they turned to a guy who didn't really have a national reputation, Harding, and he was just sort of nice enough. He was from Ohio, which is indeed a swing state. It's funny, the other candidate in this election was also from Ohio, so James Cox. Both parties picked somebody from Ohio. That gives you a sense for how important it was as a swing state. And speaking of swing states, we're trying to keep our lessons relevant. What are the swing states today? So this is a chart from a website called 270 to Win that shows what are the states that are solidly Republican. And this is for the 2020 election based on predictions and polling, whoever it is. Who's going up against Trump. Obviously, at this point, it's most likely Biden. But you can see Ohio, not actually a swing state, often is, but they're giving Ohio to Trump at this point. Arizona is an odd new swing state, so it's a shift in blue in this area. But this is, of course, as we've talked about, where this election is going to be won and lost. Picking running mates. One of the themes of the 1920s is that presidents were picking running mates very strategically based on the electoral count. So it's one of the things that the electoral college system does for us is makes it so that where the president nominee is from and where their vice president is from become very strategic. Because, for example, if Biden could pick a vice president from Wisconsin or Minnesota or Pennsylvania, someone popular from there, that would be extremely beneficial in the election, potentially. There's other factors, of course. All right, folks, but back to our story here. So we get Harding. Harding is known mostly for his womanizing and his basic kindness, but no, he was a laissez-faire, pro-business conservative, for sure. Harding was part of a string of Republican presidents in the 1920s who, resemble more the modern Republican Party in that they're very pro-business, opposed to government intervention in the economy. So labor unions did not fare well under the Harding and then Coolidge and then Hoover administration. We did not see a lot of antitrust action, and we did not see the kind of progressive legislation that we'd seen in the decade before. And that's characteristic of the 20s. It's a period of deregulation. The trend in politics at that point was started by a great Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who is kind of the father of fiscal conservatism. So he pushed the line that you must balance budgets, that we have to keep taxes low, and that budgets have to stay balanced. And that is something that has become, at least it was part of the Republican Party agenda. It's part of an element of conservatism up until, I think, recently, when Republicans are no longer in any way, shape, or form fiscally conservative. But that was a defining characteristic of the Republican Party starting in the 20s. And Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of Treasury under Harding and then under Coolidge and then under Hoover as well, made sure, and this comes up as a cause of the Great Depression that we're going to have to talk about because one of the things they did wrong leading into the Great Depression is they refused to throw money at the problem. Even FDR, who's known as doing the whole Big Great Society program, was reluctant to. FDR was reluctant to spend money without raising taxes in order to cover the cost of whatever he spent it on. So he didn't run a deficit, and we'll talk more about that later. But all right, moving on here. Herbert Hoover was also in Harding's cabinet, he obviously becomes president later in the decade. He was known because during the war, he worked for the War Department that was in charge of supplying World War I armies with food. His famous quote as part of running that agency was, "Food will win the war." So he was a very popular guy because loved all over Europe. He was a hero in Belgium. So anyway, Hoover does come into politics in the early 1920s. All right, folks, but Harding is mostly known for his scandals. So I wouldn't say that you need to know all of these. It's a string of scandals. Basically, his cabinet was just dropping like flies. All around him, there was corruption. Harding has one of the most timely deaths ever, you got to say, because he died just as all his scandals were bubbling to the surface. And when he died, people just sort of stopped digging into how close it got to him because the guy's dead, and let's just move on. So Harding was at least complicit, at least negligent in allowing his people under him to get involved in scandals. But the most famous of them all is the Teapot Dome scandal. That's probably the one that you should just sort of remember. This involved Navy oil. So the U.S. Navy was storing large amounts of oil, as we still do. The United States has a strategic petroleum reserve to this day that has hundreds of millions of gallons of oil in it. And it is there for difficult times. Who knows? Maybe we'll tap it now with the coronavirus. And actually, no, oil is cheaper than anything right now. But if we were in a war and we were running out of oil supplies, the government wanted to have oil in reserve. Makes sense. So the crime was that the Secretary of the Interior was quietly selling the Navy's oil on the side to businesses and pocketing the money, upwards of $250 million or something. So the Teapot Dome Scandal just refers to the Secretary of the Interior being a serious crook selling Navy oil on the side. The liquor permit scandal was the Attorney General was giving out permits to make liquor this is during Prohibition. So the permit allowed you to make liquor for industrial use and military use, and he was selling permits. He also was granting pardons, the presidential power of the pardon. Here is the Attorney General basically saying to people who are in jail, if you pay me enough, I'll get the president to pardon you and get you out of jail. So. And then the Veterans Bureau, that one's even nastier. This was money that was supposed to be serving World War I veterans, and hundreds of millions of dollars were stolen by the head of the Veterans Department. So 1921, 1922, 1923, these scandals are boiling up, and then Harding has a heart attack in San Francisco and dies. Like I said, most well-timed death ever. So most importantly of Harding is that he set a path of isolationism. He got us out of a lot of, we're not in Versailles on foreign policy, but at home, sort of running a nice guy, eyes closed administration, allowing anyone and everyone to rip off the American people. So my favorite aspect of Harding, though, we got to take a moment to note, was his romances. Oh my gosh. Harding was president at a time when the press didn't really publicize what even most people knew about a president's private life. Isn't that quaint? But these letters just came out, and I gotta pause for a second and read one to you, because this is Harding writing to his mistress in 1912. This letter just became public about a year ago. I love your poise of perfect thighs when they hold me in paradise. I love the rose your garden grows. All right, I can't even read this whole thing. You guys can read it. Pause it, but it gets good. What happened in Montreal? That's what I want to know. But yes, Warren was not a faithful man. This woman, Carrie Phillips, actually, he had a split with her a little bit later, because it turned out that she, during World War I, was a German sympathizer. And he, in fact, broke up with her because he said, I must do my duty to my country and not talk to you anymore. So anyway, moving on from Harding. There's a cartoon from the time showing the whole government for sale. And this is a reference to the Teapot Dome scandal and the Veterans Affairs scandal, selling American stuff. All right. And this is Coolidge. And I don't know who else, but the idea is in the election of 1924, everyone was running as fast as they could away from the scandal, but Coolidge squeaked by and he gets in there. So in 1924, Democrats follow the trend of the 1920s in that they revert to a Southern party, as you can see. The Democratic Party in all three elections during the 1920s just only get Southern states. In fact, in this election, they nominated this guy Davis, who was from West Virginia, and it was the first nominee coming from a Confederate state since before the Civil War. So it was a poor choice on their part. And the Ku Klux Klan was deeply influential in the Democratic Party at the time, as was the Prohibition folks. In fact, here we got it. The Republicans went with Cool Cal. He's kind of like Harding, just sort of a nice guy, not known for a lot, kept to himself. Cool Cal, Calvin Coolidge. Democrats had a crazy convention that year. They had 102 ballots before they could get to a majority to pick anybody, and they went with John Davis. The Ku Klux Klan was at the convention, a significant presence. And then you had the last of the great progressives. The Progressive Party ran Fighting Bob Lafayette. Where is he? That's all right. And he, as you can see, did kind of well up around in the farm states. But no, Coolidge gets the election, and we have another 4 years. He chose not to run in 1928. 4 more years of laissez-faire economic conservatism. Andrew Mellon still running the Treasury. His famous line, Coolidge, is classic. After all, the chief business of the American people is business. Very famous quote. But of course, when business melts down and the profiteers destroy the entire economy and leave 25% of the American people without work. All of these quotes that are pro-business, laissez-faire, come back to haunt these guys. All right. Calvin Coolidge, though, certainly a guy I'd want to go fishing with, wouldn't you? All right, so Coolidge presided over a very good time. This is deep into the booming 20s. We got the Jazz Age, we got the Harlem Renaissance raging, but everyone's happy except African Americans, of course. But even for them, times were changing and improving in the 20s, but not for farmers. So a big part of our story is the disappointment of the farmers with the Republican administrations of the 20s. Farmers were bumming. After World War I, they were struggling with lower demand, and so prices were just collapsing. Mechanization was helping the big corporate farms, but of course the millions of small farmers out there were struggling to compete with the newly mechanized farms. So the story here is that farmers were demanding government help. They were already in depression in the 1920s, and they were screaming and marching on Washington, and there were millions of Americans who were going unemployed because of a declining farm sector. So that political movement brought to Congress the McNary-Haugen Bill, which was kind of a big government, somewhat of a socialistic enterprise, though it's not far from things that we now today do in our economy. This would allow the government to buy surplus crop and even fix prices and really try to just boost prices in among farms. And so they got it. It passed both the House and the Senate. Oops. And then Coolidge vetoed it twice, and he did so right after each election. And so it felt sneaky. Farmers were bitter. And this story is important because the bitterness of farmers is very apparent to Republicans in the next election in 1828, because Hoover has to make some promises to farmers, and that becomes part of our story. Okay, folks, this is a great quote from Calvin Coolidge about just standing up for private enterprise and warning against federal government action. We should avoid the error of seeking in laws the causes of the ills of agriculture. Imagine if President Trump was up there today saying we should avoid using laws or having the pretense that government can solve these coronavirus problems. It's not government, it's the American people must solve these problems themselves. So that kind of rhetoric was, made farmers bitter in the early 20s. But then when the market crashed, these words even rang more untruthful. So in 1928, the third in a row of nice, affable Republicans who are laissez-faire conservatives run. Democrats went with Al Smith, which was actually the first major party to nominate a Catholic, and he did pretty well. He's from New York, so Democrats were trying to get some political support outside of the South in 28, and they did all right. But no, it was a vicious campaign where Al Smith was torn to pieces for being Catholic. We did not see another Catholic running for president or getting a major party nomination until Kennedy, I believe. Well, he was, of course, the first to win. All right, in 1928, as you can see, Democrats are just getting crushed. They didn't even win his home state. But there you go. We get Hoover, another 4 years. So Herbert Hoover, another just like Harding and Coolidge, known for his pro-business attitudes. And when the Depression hit, he is the fall guy. So we'll get to that. But he's got another quote like Coolidge's. In the midst of his presidency, he says, "Unemployment, in the sense of distress, is widely disappearing. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We have not yet reached the goal, but given a chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in the sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation." How'd those words ring about a couple months later? when the entire economy melted. So yeah, he looked like the fool. All right, but one last thing I want to say before we end this video is that what is critical about all the issues with the farmers is that Hoover made some promises in 1928 when he ran. He had to. He could not see the farmers abandon the Republican Party as they were threatening to do. And so as soon as he took office, he did what he said he would do, and he got Congress going on a tariff. And he said he would protect farmers with the tariff. He said that, and it would have. That was the idea: is that if you put tariffs up against, foreign strawberries being imported, then our strawberry farmers will be able to sell to the American market. And he talked a big talk about how we must protect our agricultural industries. And farmers were happy; they were listening. But what happened is that Congress got to work on the promised tariff that was supposed to be about agriculture. But then every industry, every business in America heard, oh, they're putting up tariffs. And so they descend on Washington. And the Republican Party is, of course, very pro-business at the time. So it's a free feeding frenzy of tariffs because everyone wants protection. First, the automobile industry, and then the toaster industry, and then the textile industry, and then every single agricultural interest. And they start pouring on and building a tariff that becomes monumental. The largest tariff in U.S. history, an increase over 6,000 different items, all get protective tariffs. The moment they released that bill publicly was the first dip in 1929. The very first little downturn was the day that Congress revealed what it was intending. And so some say that is the most immediate of the causes, was a sudden hike in tariffs. Now, why would a tariff that's supposed to protect American industries cause the market to crash? Well, because everyone knew other countries would strike back. If we put a tariff on them, they'll put a tariff back on us, and we have trade war, which is exactly what happened. So in the midst of a depression, we also had nations erecting barriers all over the world. Germany responded, France responded, everybody responded to the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff. But this is definitely too long already. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop this and we're going to finish part one. But thank you to those of you who made it this far. I guess I'm getting used to this. It's a little weird. I didn't like the way I had to move this video around the whole time. But now it's time for me to get back to doing what I was doing. And that is calisthenics. All right. Oh, man. Now you can see y'all.